Most people think spiritual awakening is the moment everything finally makes sense. Like you reach some finish line, like the search ends, and life suddenly becomes clear. But Jung discovered something most people never talk about. Awakening isn't the arrival. It's the door opening. What comes after, what the ancients called Sophia, is when you stop seeking. Not because you gave up, but because something in you finally settled. Sophia is not about being enlightened. It's not about being healed. And it's definitely not about being better than anyone else. Sophia is the stage where you stop trying to become something and start living as who you already are. Where your inner and outer lives finally stop fighting each other. Where nothing needs to be proven. Jung would say this is not spiritual achievement. It's psychological maturity. And it only comes after you've faced yourself deeply, and often without realizing that's what you were doing. The signs of this stage don't look impressive, but once you recognize them, you can't unsee them. In this video, you'll discover 6 signs that suggest you've already reached this state. These signs aren't a checklist to tick off. They're resonances, vibrations that either echo in you or remain silent. Then, are you ready to recognize that you might already be where you've always wanted to go? Sign 1. The wound no longer bleeds. The first sign isn't that your wounds are gone. They're still there, exactly where they've always been. You remember what happened. You remember how it shaped you. You remember the version of yourself that didn't know how to carry it yet. But when you look back now, your body doesn't flinch. There's no sharp contraction. No emotional reflex pulling you into the past. The story exists, but it doesn't demand to be relived. The pain didn't disappear, changed its role. What once controlled your reactions now sits quietly in the background. It no longer defines how you see yourself or how you interpret the world. It's part of your history, not the lens you're trapped inside. Think of a tree struck by lightning. The mark remains in the bark for decades, but the tree continues to grow around it. The wound becomes part of the structure, not a threat to it. Carl Jung described this as shadow integration, not the act of repairing something broken, and not the fantasy of erasing darkness. It's the moment you recognize that the parts of you once resisted were never mistakes. They were responses. They formed when you needed them, and they stayed until you were ready to understand what they carried. At this stage, the inner conflict softens. You're no longer arguing with yourself, trying to prove that you're healed or worthy. The voices that once questioned your value begin to lose their urgency. Not because you forced them into silence, but because you finally listened long enough to hear what they were protecting. This is when the wound becomes a scar. It remains visible, but it no longer dictates your movement. And instead of pulling you backward, it stands as quiet evidence of something simple and profound. You survived, and you don't need to fight yourself anymore. Sign 2. The spiritual ego falls away. The second sign is easy to overlook because nothing dramatic happens. There's no breakthrough moment, no announcement inside you, just a subtle shift in what no longer feels important. The spiritual identity you once carried begins to loosen its grip. You stop caring about being awake, about being healed, conscious, or further along than anyone else. Not because you've rejected spirituality, but because the labels feel strangely hollow now. They don't describe your experience anymore. They don't add anything, and they don't ask to be defended. You notice this most clearly around other people. You no longer compare paths or measure depth. You're not scanning conversations for signs of who's evolved and who isn't. There's no internal ranking system running in the background. And without trying to be humble, you also stop needing to be recognized. If someone sees you as wise, it doesn't move you. If they misunderstand you, it doesn't disturb you either. Your sense of self no longer depends on being seen a certain way. You can sit with someone who's just beginning their inner journey and feel completely at ease. There's no urge to correct them or guide them forward. No subtle impatience. No sense that you should intervene. You understand something now that can't be learned from books. Growth has its own timing. Awareness unfolds at the pace it needs to, and interfering with that process doesn't help. It intrudes. What once looked like compassion you now recognize as control. And what once felt like teaching, you see more clearly as reassurance for the ego. So, you let people walk their paths without commentary. You remain present, without instruction. And in that quiet restraint, the spiritual ego dissolves. Not through effort, but because it's no longer needed. What remains isn't identity. It's simplicity. Sign 3. The body becomes the compass. At this stage, wisdom stops living in your thoughts. It settles somewhere deeper. You no longer need constant confirmation from outside yourself. You don't ask endlessly for signs, advice, or reassurance. Your body begins to speak clearly, and you've learned how to listen. When something is wrong, you don't need to analyze it. There's a subtle tightening, a heaviness that wasn't there before, a quiet resistance that shows up before words ever do. And when something is right, the signal is just as clear. Your breath deepens without effort. Your shoulders drop. Your system settles into itself. There's no excitement rush, no dramatic certainty, just a calm internal yes. You stop chasing elevated states because you no longer confuse intensity with truth. And you stop fearing low states because you understand they're not failures. Restlessness passes. Stillness passes. Energy comes and goes. None of it threatens your sense of balance anymore. You begin to recognize that contraction isn't a problem to fix. It's information. And expansion isn't something to cling to. It's simply another phase in the rhythm. Earlier, you may have tried to rise above the body, to outthink it, to transcend it in the name of growth. Now you see that real integration moves in the opposite direction. Downward, into sensation, into presence. The body is no longer something you manage or override. It becomes an ally, a quiet guide that responds honestly to what aligns and what doesn't. You don't force yourself forward anymore. You notice when something pulls you open, and when it closes you down. And instead of arguing with those signals, you trust them. This is the return to embodiment, not as a practice, but as a way of being. You are no longer trying to escape the body. You have come home to it. Sign 4. Solitude becomes fullness. One of the most misunderstood signs of Sophia is the way your relationship with solitude changes. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal, as if you've stepped back from the world, as if something disappointed you. But that's not what's happening. You're not avoiding people. You're not retreating out of fear or exhaustion. You're simply no longer fragmented when you're alone. Being alone doesn't feel like something you have to endure. It doesn't feel like waiting for life to begin again. It feels like room. Room to exist without adjusting yourself to anyone else's expectations. Room to move through your day without negotiating your inner state. A kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything from you. Earlier in life, solitude may have felt uncomfortable. It might have amplified restlessness or uncertainty. So you filled it, often without realizing that's what you were doing. You stayed busy. You stayed connected. You stayed engaged enough to avoid sitting too closely with yourself. Now, that impulse has softened. You no longer use relationships to stabilize your sense of identity. You don't seek connection to escape inner emptiness. When you choose closeness now, it comes from a place that is already settled. This changes the quality of connection. You can enjoy intimacy without losing your center. You can step back without anxiety. You don't confuse emotional intensity with depth. Carl Jung described this shift as existential self-sufficiency. Not isolation, not emotional distance, but the end of searching for yourself through another person. You don't need to be reflected back to feel real. You don't rely on presence to confirm your worth. Your sense of wholeness stands on its own. Solitude is no longer something to fear. It becomes a stable ground beneath you, and from that ground, every relationship is entered freely. Not to complete you, but to meet you. Sign 5. The quiet of the will and time. At this stage, a subtle transformation occurs in how you navigate the world. Your will is no longer driven by a hunger for validation or a fear of being not enough. Earlier in life, your actions were often a fight against the current, an effort to force life into a specific shape. Now, that urgency has dissolved. You still move, act, and create, but the force behind it is alignment, not lack. Success and failure lose their power to define you. They become merely information. You've learned that life doesn't need to be conquered. It needs to be met. This internal shift changes your relationship with time. The future is no longer a destination where peace finally waits, and the past is no longer a territory that needs defending. You stop postponing your life. The pressure of when begins to loosen, and presence becomes your default state, rather than a disciplined practice. You move through your days with a growing trust that whatever comes can be met from exactly where you are. You're not racing ahead of yourself anymore. You've realized that the path doesn't lead to peace. The path is peace, experienced one moment at a time. Sign 6. The harmony of coherent presence. The final movement into Sophia is characterized by a compassion that has shed the need to be a savior. You still feel deeply, but you no longer absorb the pain of others as a burden you must fix. You've realized that every person has an essential process that cannot be outsourced. By stepping back from the urge to rescue, you offer others their true dignity. Your help becomes quieter. You offer space instead of advice, and presence instead of persuasion. Unexpectedly, your silence begins to accomplish more than your words ever did. People feel a sense of coherence in you that invites them to find their own balance. This leads to a life that looks, from the outside, entirely ordinary. The hunger for peak experiences and spiritual highs fades away, replaced by the sacredness of the everyday. There is no longer a hierarchy between the spiritual and the practical. Washing dishes, or walking through the park, carries the same weight as a grand revelation. You are no longer performing for an audience or narrating your growth. Life is simply being lived. Sophia is the moment you stop leaving your life to find it. It is what remains when you stop running from yourself and finally stop arguing with your own nature. Sophia is not something you reach. It's not a destination, and it's not a reward. It's what remains when you stop running from yourself. Nothing was won. Nothing about you became extraordinary. What changed was simpler than that. You stopped fighting. You stopped arguing with your own nature. You stopped trying to correct yourself into someone else. And in that stopping, something quietly came into view. Not a new identity, not a higher version of you, just what was always there, waiting without urgency. If these words resonate, it doesn't mean you've achieved anything. It doesn't mean you're further along than others. It means you allowed something to surface without forcing it. Something familiar, something honest. The wisdom was never missing. It was covered by effort, by seeking, by the need to become. And when those layers fell away, nothing dramatic appeared, only clarity. So the question isn't whether you've reached Sophia. That question belongs to the mind that's still measuring. The real question is quieter. Are you willing to see yourself as you are, without the stories you've been telling, without the roles you've learned to play, without the endless search for what comes next? Just this moment, just you here. And for once, that's enough.